So as Jim and Steve mentioned, one of my roles is the director of this marketing and engineering program. I work with our director of research, Amanda Policione. She did get married this year, so I'm still working on the new name. But I work with her a lot on putting together this research, and we're going to walk through it from pretty much a comprehensive overview here today. As Jim mentioned, we had about 2,800 engineers that participated in these 3 studies. As Steve alluded to, we expanded the brand in 2014 to include 3 different research studies. We did quarterly webcasts. We have this central hub of content that we call the Marketing and Engineers blog. We have newsletters that we send out. But what I want to talk about here is a few things, and I'll actually zoom in, make it a little bit easier for everybody to see. So from those 2,800 engineers, a pretty equal representation among our 3 brands. You can see that from those 2,800 engineers, some of the most common job titles were, president, owner, director of engineering. You have senior electrical engineer, automation and control engineers. And the reason we know what their job titles are is because all of these engineers that participated are already in our database. And if you have a chance to talk to Rick Ellis, who's our director of audience development, he'll be happy to tell you all about our database of engineers. But we have about 400,000 engineers in our network. These are all our engineers that we communicate with on a regular basis in print, newsletters, etc. The engineers that exist in that database, we surveyed, we used them as kind of our sample size, and we know that from those 2,800 engineers, these are the most common job titles. But we wanted to take it a step further, and we wanted to figure out how we could segment the information to make it more relevant to not only us, but our marketing partners. So this example is from the Consulting and Specifying Engineer group. These are fire protection engineers. So I know that within the CSE slice of the pie right here, I know that 47% of the engineers who participated in our survey buy, specify fire protection equipment, fire systems, so fire alarms, fire panels, etc. I know that from our database, doing a database match, that they work on projects typically over $20 million in value. And we know that their top 2 facility types, based on the engineers who participated in the survey, are office buildings and hospitals. So we can segment our data, and to Steve and Jim's point earlier, to become not only better publishers and content providers ourselves, make it more relevant to each of our audience, engineering audiences, but we can do this with all the data we're going to walk through here, all the marketing engineers research. We can segment it by industry, job type, by specify authority, company size, etc. So you're going to see that from us here in the next probably 3 to 6 months, where we'll start to kind of unveil some of this segmented data. Now jumping into some of the research, we asked them in our spring 2014 study, which focused on the value of content marketing and search engine behavior. We asked them, what is the value of content marketing to you? And you can see that the engineers said 75% of them are more likely to do business with a company they see as a regular content provider. So kind of what are we doing with all this content? Why do we create all this content? Why are we doing content marketing, etc. And then these next 3 slides kind of show the trend line. So you'll see this is from the spring 2014 study. The fall/winter 2014 study we did was on registration forms, e-newsletter preferences, blogs, and then the one we just completed was on the content needs for a buyer's journey and webcast preferences. But we asked these next few questions on each survey, and you see when an engineer starts their process, what is their valuable content source? You see on all 3 of these slides, search engines, supplier vendor websites, and trade publications. So they're coming to supplier sites. They're starting with search engines. I think it's going to be tough to kind of compete with that because we find a lot of our traffic comes from search engines itself, but they're seeing suppliers as a valuable source of information. But then when we started to get down into the kind of the detail here, you see spring 2014, we asked them, within those sources, what are your preferred content types? So you see product information. The engineers need their products. And you go down the list. You see trade publication articles, print and online, white papers, case studies, etc. You see down kind of at the bottom that podcasts was kind of low and some things that didn't trend that well. But as you see, now moving into the fall 2014 data, you see that products are still high. You see blogs kind of at the lower part of the list, but trade publication articles, white papers, these are where they're going for information to help them do their job better. Same thing, this is from the latest research. So you get the idea that we have this trending data, and what does this tell us? It tells us that engineers always need products. It kind of led to this Products for Engineers database that you heard Steve talk about earlier. But we take a look at this and we say, okay, maybe we should even change the name of things that we have on our site. We have blogs on our site, but as you see, blogs didn't trend out very well in terms of where they see as a valuable content source. So maybe even just changing the name of something to Resource Center or Industry Viewpoint or something like that might help, an engineer see it as a more valuable source of content rather than a blog. They might think it's a little too opinion-based. Moving into social media, even though I just kind of talked about that they don't really see social media as a primary source for engineering information, this slide needs a little explanation. So the green chart is actually the hardly ever. So what you want to take away from this is that LinkedIn was the #1 for them. They go to LinkedIn as their top social media channel for information. And then kind of going from there, we were surprised by the Google Plus results. We took a look at how we asked the question. We said, well, did they see that as Google? But the results are what they are. We said, well, they clicked on Google Plus as their second most valuable social media channel. And we saw SlideShare as actually a pretty good source, but then we saw this and we said, well, maybe the engineers just don't see it as a good source of information. And we asked a lot of questions about over or under 40. I don't think it's old versus young, it's just how we split it up. But you can see that there's not a huge discrepancy between the over 40 crowd or under 40 crowd. They were going to Google Plus a little bit more, but there wasn't a huge gap. Moving into the search engine behavior section, obviously they're going to Google first and foremost. 83% of the time they're going there. These next two slides kind of go into a little bit more detail where they're active seekers of content. These engineers seek out information on a regular basis, multiple times per week. They're actively going out trying to find information that helps them do their job better. And then this slide, I think, kind of tells it all about the engineers, where they said almost 70% of the engineers who responded said that they would go to page 3 of search results before they adjusted their search. I'm not an engineer. I never go to page 3 of search results in Google. I always adjust the feed, but it kind of told us that you're never kind of out of the fight, so to say, if you're not on page 1, which Steve Krull can probably help you with if you're not on page 1, but these engineers are going to go and seek out good information, page 3 and beyond in the search engine results before they adjust their feed or adjust their search string. So getting into a little bit more data on the inbound marketing and newsletters. We know as a company that an engineer's time and kind of their mind share in their inbox is hard to get. We as a company send out 50 editorial newsletters a month across all our brands by topic and by different industries. But from the engineers who participated, they say they subscribe to on average 9 different newsletters. So their mind share is pretty tough in their inbox. And the next couple slides will talk about how to improve the successful elements of a newsletter, but you can see that they're already subscribing to stuff from us. They already receive messages from suppliers. And these next two slides kind of talk about what do they like about newsletters, the successful elements. You see they like new technical content available. They like application stories. Steve mentioned quick facts, bolded list. If an engineer is going to read it on their phone, they need to be able to get the information and either save it or kind of make a mental note to come back and click into that article. But if it's a full text box, they might not be interested in, fully in reading that, especially if they're on the go, if they're on a job site or on the plant floor. And then some of the verbatim responses. So we actually had an open-ended question, which is always fun in terms of aggregating all of the open-ended responses, but we kind of cataloged them into these 6 or 7 different topics where we said, by far and away, they said focus on a specific topic and go into greater detail. Make it a little less promotional, have new technical content available. I mean, those are, you can see in some of the poll quotes, like what they're telling us about what they like about newsletters. And the takeaway for me on this is, and we talk about it internally all the time, is that as a publisher, we are a content developer and distributor in a lot of ways. We do it across a lot of different channels. We have a lot of content. And we're engaging with these people on a regular basis. So this research that we use isn't just designed to kind of help our marketing partners. It's designed to also help us, I would say, with best practices for our newsletters. So we take this as direct feedback from our target market, which are the engineers. So moving on to the registration and lead gen. So as a publisher, we get asked quite often, what kind of lead generation options do you have? And for a lot of years, we were telling people you don't want to ask, or put a registration wall in front of every piece of content that you might run on the site. People just don't like to fill out that many fields of information. So with this research, we kind of just reference it now when we're kind of asked about, hey, well, what should I put a registration wall in front of? And the engineers told us that webcasts are kind of the top thing that they're willing to register for. Product information, white papers, but looking at the bottom of the list, you see blogs. They don't particularly want to register for your blog, so I wouldn't put a registration wall in front of it. And then we ask them, what are you likely to provide? And this is another question we get asked. If we want to do 15 fields of information in front of your webcast. I said, okay, but when you look at research like this, you can see that after 5 fields of information, first, last, work email, company, job title, your chances of success drop by almost half. So you can kind of see that these engineers, they don't want to give up 5, 6, 10 fields of information. Try to figure out which ones you really need and then try to work to gather little bits of information to kind of match them in their buyer profile or buyer persona, as Dan will talk about in a little bit. But interesting stat, you can see how quickly it drops off. Kind of the final 2 sections of my presentation here are kind of on the value of accredited webcasts. So this is from the latest research. You guys are kind of the first ones to see it outside of CFA Media. And as Steve and Jim mentioned earlier, we do a lot of webcasts. We do a little bit more than 50 webcasts a year. We are accredited to give out continuing education credits. So an engineer comes, takes a test, they prove that they learned something during the event. We do have sponsors for those. But you see the difference in time spent on webcasts. The engineers are going to spend almost twice as much time with an accredited webcast than non-accredited. In regards to how many they attend per year, it's not a huge gap, but you see they're willing to attend 4 different accredited webcasts per year versus 3 non-accredited, and we're just kind of curious, would they pay for these things? Would they pay for webcasts? Because it does help them keep their professional engineer license in a lot of cases, so what value do they place on keeping that license? And they come to us, and we always joke that usually in December, right around the time all of the CEU credits need to be reported to the state board, we see a big spike in our on-demand webcast traffic. It's actually pretty amusing every year. So, kind of going to the idea of why they attend these webcasts, it's kind of a no-brainer. Continuing education, codes and standards, product information and demos, this is what they like to see on the webcasts. We use this as a model for our editorial webcasts. You see a lot of our stuff on codes and standards. We don't have a lot of testimonials, as you can see, mainly because they don't seem to gain a lot of traction with our engineers. But this is what they see as valuable in terms of webcasts. Now the last couple slides here is just on kind of the buyer's journey content needs. So we asked them, in advance of a project, how many months on a big project do you start researching? Now there's a lot of data out there about buy cycles, and you're going to hear some stuff today about how to map that out successfully. But they told us on average 8 months is when they start researching a large-scale project. Smaller projects, 3 months, but how this adjusts your own company's buy cycles for their products, it's an interesting bit of information that these engineers are active seekers of information. They want to figure out what the latest trends are for a product or a project, and they're going to start about 8 months in advance. This is another one that needs a little bit of, I would say, description. So we asked them what types of content do you need along your buyer's journey. Kind of in the beginning, early stage awareness category, all the way through the end. And you see products as the top one there is a very popular one throughout the whole process, probably the most consistent. They need product information, data sheets, etc. They use us, trade publication, articles, print and online, kind of in that early stage. They're trying to see what the other engineers are talking about, a best practices article, a white paper maybe. But then as you kind of move along here, you start to see they start to get a little more specific. Webcasts, product demo videos, e-guides, things like that. You can kind of see that as they move forward with this stuff, they need a little bit more specific data. So do you have all of these content types along your buyer's journey as you guys would have identified in your company? So it's interesting to see how they use the different types of content. And then when we ask them, and this is probably more important for this, the suppliers, vendors in the room, what are the most important factors in your decision-making process? You see product quality, number one, service and support, technical advantage. I see cost further down the list than I would say if we took a poll of the room, if everybody said, well, how does an engineer buy our products? Well, cost probably shows up, 1, 2, maybe 3. But you can see that they're very concerned about the product quality, the technical superiority, even ahead of their, let's say, the cost of the product. So there's a lot of different research on this specific question that exists out there. There's an IBM study that says 70% of the process is already done. There's some stuff I've seen as high as in the 80s. We asked them, when do you contact suppliers? When do you kind of bring them in the loop on your buy process? And you can kind of see that almost 40% of the process was already done for engineers. They had already kind of made up their mind before they even raised their hand and said, I want to talk to the supplier, I want to talk to a salesperson, or I want to talk to a product expert or something like that. So in regards to contacting suppliers, this is what our engineers reported. So I went through that, hopefully not too quickly, but I will open it up to kind of questions. Anybody has any questions? I think, Anissa, how much time? 9 minutes. So we have 9 minutes, or we can, move on to the next speaker. But I did want to open it up to any questions that people might have.
Over time, Patrick, as you've done these surveys, what surprised you? What are some of the key points that stand out as?
That's an interesting question, Mark. And to me, I think we often get asked, well, what's the difference between kind of the older generation of engineers and the younger ones? How do the younger engineers get their information? And especially when we can set the trend line at 40, over under 40, the older generation is using content at about the same rate, or consuming content in several channels at about the same rate as the, let's say, the under 40 crowd. So to us, we look at all of our representative samples and we say the average age of the people responding to our survey was, I think, 52, between 48 and 52 years age. And then you see that when we started to break it out for the different age questions, there wasn't a huge gap. I think that they just consume content in whatever way possible, and something that I think you look at kind of the infographic of who the people were that were taking these surveys, they're senior level, they're senior level people at the organization. And so how do they get that information? They use it. They're making different decisions than the younger engineers. They're making whole-scale project decisions rather than maybe just kind of learning their craft. And you'll hear some of that stuff when we have the supplier and the engineer roundtable coming up. But that was probably the first thing that I know that stuck out to me. So, any other questions? Feedback? Okay, thank you.